All right, give us one more second and we'll get started in just a moment. All right, everyone. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation on safeguarding your right to vote and voter suppression tactics. This is an important conversation as part of our Road to November, and one that's certainly been in the news recently, and we're really excited and just thrilled to have Jessie Burns from the League of Women Voters here in New Jersey today to talk about this important conversation. Before I hand it over to Jessie, I am going to just do a couple of housekeeping items. We've got a lot of people here joined in the Zoom room for today's conversation. There are a couple of ways that you can interact, and we really want for you to do that. If you want to chat in the chat box, we'll be here chatting away and we'll be able to answer some of your questions. If you also have questions you'd like to ask live, we'd love to hear from you and see your face. So just raise your Zoom hand and I'll jump in and be able to unmute you so that you can ask your questions. For those of you who are watching on Facebook Live today, welcome. You can also ask questions in the comments or shoot us a message to our messenger on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring that throughout today's conversation. We'll be able to answer them there as well. But we are really excited again, Jessie, for you to be here today. Thank you so much for this important information and for leading today's conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share out my screen. Give me a second. Okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about voter suppression today, and which is, last time I was with you all, I think we talked a lot about get out the vote. So this is the exact opposite of that. This is making sure that the vote does not, the turnout does not happen. So voter suppression is a really wide and broad term. And I think people think of it as only a few activities. So I want to talk about what voter suppression actually is. And it's really any effort, either legal or illegal, that prevents voters from registering to vote or voting. So barriers to the ballot are often considered voter suppression. And in particular, voter suppression laws and tactics tend to have a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this particular slide because, as you can see, there are a lot of different examples of what voter suppression can look like. So I think that it's important to realize that in the last few years alone, over 200 restrictive voting bills have been introduced in 40 states. And we are seeing the largest rollback of voting rights in a century as a result of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, I believe in 2013. So ever since that particular case, which allowed for this rollback, we've seen states taking advantage of not needing to have any kind of federal approval of certain voter suppression tactics that impact marginalized communities. So when we talk about things like voter ID laws, it's important to understand that restrictive voter ID laws, I think that people, sometimes they don't realize why this is such a big deal because it might not apply to them personally. They might think, well, I have a government issued ID, but millions of Americans don't. 11% of US citizens, which equals more than 21 million Americans, do not have a government issued ID. And of that 11%, a quarter of those people are specifically Black voters. So these restrictive voter ID laws that we're seeing pop up across the country do impact communities of color's ability to access the ballot. Another thing that we see, and I think that a lot of folks are seeing right now as we see these long lines, particularly in Georgia, that we've seen all through the pandemic, is the cutting to voting hours and early voting, and in combination with the consolidation of polling places and polling place closures. So if all of these things are working together to make it harder for Americans to get to a polling location at a time that works for them to cast a ballot. Southern states have closed over 1,200 polling places in the past couple of years. So it's an extreme crisis, I think, in our country. A lot of what I'm talking about, voter ID laws, polling place closures, cuts to voting hours and early voting, doesn't apply to New Jersey. We are consolidating polling places for the pandemic, but we really expanded and made vote by mail super accessible. So I hope that offsets any long lines that we might see on election day. New Jersey doesn't right now have very robust early voting, which I think is an issue. Legislation is being introduced to expand early voting in our state. And the problem with not having a really robust in-person system in the state is that right now, pretty much in non-pandemic times, I'm going to talk about, if you want to apply for a vote by mail ballot in person, you usually have to go to your county seat. And that is an issue for many folks to be able to find transportation or time to get there. So you want to make places that voters can vote other than, Tuesday between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. More available in our state. And I think that we'll see a move towards that as we realize what kind of improvements we need in our infrastructure as a result of the things that we're learning during this pandemic. Something else that is a example of voter suppression are voter roll purges. I want to talk about this in two ways. In New Jersey, there's been a lot of talk about people receiving ballots for folks that no longer live there, or people that have, their kids who are away at school or things like that. So the alternative to that, it's important to maintain and upgrade the voting rolls, but you have to do it carefully so that you're not purging eligible voters. And across the nation, we've seen 17.3 million registrations between 2016, the 2016 presidential, and the 2018 midterm election be removed from the rolls. So you have to be careful that you have a system for maintaining your voting rolls, which makes sure that they're not incredibly outdated, but at the same time, you're not purging eligible voters, because what will happen is they will turn up to vote and they will no longer be on the rolls and they will not be able to cast a ballot. And then, as I mentioned, New Jersey made vote by mail really accessible. We did not have the ability to cure a ballot, which means the ability to fix a ballot if you get flagged for a signature mismatch, but we've made that improvement and we now have that in place. So that is a significant improvement that New Jersey has recently made. Other states, though, require, some states still require you to give an excuse to get a vote by mail ballot. Some states require you to have a witness sign your vote by mail ballot. Some states don't have a cure process in place if your ballot is rejected because of mismatch. All of these things, as we're watching this play out across the country, all of these things are impacting communities of color, disabled voters, voters with disabilities, elderly voters at a greater proportion than other voters. So people that should be able to use mail-in ballots are being kept out of the system unnecessarily, and it's an issue. Another voter suppression tactic is gerrymandering, and a lot of folks don't think about this, but the manipulation of legislative and congressional maps leads to the inability for voters to choose somebody that actually represents them. So gerrymandering, I think, is a voter suppression tactic that we often don't include in lists like this, but it's really a fundamental building block for everything else. The thing that's on most people's minds when they think about voter suppression, particularly right now, is voter intimidation. So this is when you see, the kind of the chaos and disturbances at polling places. Or voter intimidation can also be things like deliberately spreading disinformation, particularly to marginalized voters, to try to keep them from participating. So I think that there's things like robocalls telling folks that that there will be police presence at polling locations, or that that they might face some kind of criminal penalties or things like this that are just not true. Another tactic is felony disenfranchisement. So when folks with criminal convictions are kept from the ballot, that is a voter suppression tactic. So I think in New Jersey, we've seen this year a huge expansion of voting rights for people on parole or probation. So starting March 17th of 2020, people on parole or probation are now eligible to register and participate, which is a huge win for democracy. Prior to that, they couldn't. In other states, like Florida, we're seeing that people that have previous criminal convictions are being kept from the polls through use of things like what's the equivalent kind of a poll tax, making them pay certain fines off before they're able to exercise their right to vote. That's voter suppression. And then, accessibility issues are huge, and they're huge in every state. So voters with disabilities, the ability to access a ballot, the ability to access a polling location, the ability to vote just like anybody else is really, really important. And the same goes for folks that have language access needs. So if they need somebody to help them with their ballot, or if they need, if ballots need to be printed in additional languages, it's important that we make these changes. A little bit about New Jersey so that folks know what your rights are here. So the first thing, the voter registration for New Jersey deadline has passed. It was October 13th, but it's still important to have an understanding that you have what your rights are to register. So in New Jersey, it's a US citizen. 17-year-olds can register to vote. They're considered pre-registered. They just can't cast a ballot until they actually turn 18, and you've had to be a resident of your county for at least 30 days before the election. When we talk about ways that you can lose your right to vote, it's important to know that a court has to have specifically determined that you lack the mental capacity to understand the act of voting. So this is pretty rare. Folks think that guardianship orders or placements and any kind of facilities revoke voting rights, and that's just not true. Only a court can do that. And of course, like I mentioned, effective March 17th, people that are on parole or probation can now register to vote. There's over 80,000 folks. And the league with our partners worked very hard during this pandemic to make sure as many of them as possible knew about this right, but I'm afraid that we might have fallen short. And there's still a lot of folks that are on parole or probation that aren't registered to vote in New Jersey and don't know that they have that right. And on election day, you have the right to vote without intimidation, threats, any kind of interference. So no blocking the polling locations, no messing with folks when they're in line. There's a lot of safeguards in place to prevent against voter intimidation. When I'm talking about voting booth here, I just want to be clear. These rights exist regardless of whether you're voting on provisional ballot or as we voted previously, not during the pandemic, on a machine. You have the right to bring your children with you. You have the right to bring someone of your choice into the voting booth to assist you if you have a disability, or if you cannot read or write in English, and you can request help from poll workers as well. You have the right to file an anonymous complaint at your polling place. There's often signs too telling you where to call if you have an issue. If you don't want to, specifically ask the poll worker for the information to file the complaint, you can follow up after you leave. You have the right to vote under your original name if you change your name since registering to vote, and you can ask for assistance at any time. Understanding that voter intimidation can look differently depending on what tactics are being used. So some examples are disrupting the lines or blocking the entrance, as I said in the last slide, violent or threatening behavior inside or outside of the polling site, displaying firearms. I think that when I talked about the robocalls, this is what I'm talking about, the spreading of false information about voting requirements or related criminal penalties. That's coming out of tactics that are, spreading misinformation through robocalls, harassing or aggressively questioning a voter's qualifications to vote. So in New Jersey, we do have challengers in the polling location. You probably never noticed them before. They sit behind the poll workers. They wear a certain badge. They cannot talk directly to voters. They can talk to the poll worker if they have an issue with that voter's ability to vote for some reason, but they cannot talk directly to the voter, which is a safeguard that we have in place. Following voters to and from their cars and confronting voters while wearing military style or official looking uniforms. One second. Okay, so kind of what to do if you see these kind of things. And I'm going to say this later, but I want to say it here too, that New Jersey has, like I said, some safeguards in place that really help us in comparison to some other states. So one of these is that we have this 100 feet buffer zone around polling locations where a lot of activity is prohibited. So some of this is positive and some of this is negative, but it's working out right now to kind of keep people away from intimidating voters in that way where they're disrupting lines or blocking entrances. So you can't electioneer. There's no groups like mine, actually, we can't interact with voters within that space even. There's really no poll watching in New Jersey. Poll watching is a positive thing normally, right? If it's done correctly, poll watching means that folks are kind of observing elections to ensure that people have the right to vote. Poll watching, when it's not really poll watching, when it's not done correctly, is interfering. That's not poll watching anymore. This is now intimidation, interfering with people's right to vote. So there's a difference, but regardless, in New Jersey, none of us can do any of this within this 100 feet, which will keep down some of the potential problems for voter intimidation on election day. So, but if you do see things, you should notify your county election officials. They're going to be able to react the quickest to any kind of problems in your neighborhood. Document what happened and call the election protection hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. I don't actually have the numbers written down, which I always mean to do. But the election protection hotline is in operation right now. If anybody has any questions or needs any information, they're available. It's nationally run with regional offices. So they'll have folks assigned for New Jersey to help. And basically what happens, we work with the election protection. What happens is if a voter calls about a problem, whether it's like voter intimidation or something like a polling place ran out of materials, or if it's improper ID requests happen at a polling location. Whatever it is, a voter calls, and then we get in contact with the county election officials to make sure that it ends. So it's multiple folks working to make sure that whatever the behavior that we need to stop ends as quickly as possible on election day. So in addition to the 100 feet, I want to talk a second about a situation. So I'm referring to the Trump administration's calls for kind of sending in military or police to polling locations around the country. So this isn't actually allowed, but what this is coming from is in the 1981 gubernatorial election in New Jersey, off-duty law enforcement officers were kind of stationed, put at polling locations, particularly in Black and brown communities. They were wearing armbands that said something along the lines of National Ballot Security Task Force. And some of them had firearms and other law enforcement kind of things like walkie-talkies and things like this. And as a result of that, there was the consent decree that prohibited that kind of activity in the future. And that was everywhere, right? So from New Jersey, there was a stop to this kind of activity. That consent decree expired in 2017. So this is the first presidential election where we don't have that in place. But that being said, there's a lot of safeguards that do exist. So in New Jersey, it's poll workers and not police officers that are primarily charged with maintaining order at polling locations. Poll workers can call police officers in if needed, but it's not usual for police officers, although it's not prohibited, for police officers to be the ones doing that work. And federal law imposes restrictions on federal officers and employees' involvement in elections. So deployment of federal troops, armed men, armed forces, they cannot be deployed to polling locations. It's against federal regulations. In addition, there are criminal penalties and laws preventing voter intimidation. And as I mentioned, we have this 100 feet restriction prohibiting certain activities with 100 feet of polling locations in place. So voters in New Jersey should not be fearful of exercising the right to vote on election day. We do have a lot in place. And in addition, New Jersey's Attorney General's office is prepared to deal with anything that might come up and is being very intentional about making sure that we're ready for anything that we might see. I'm confident, though, that New Jersey can expect a calm and peaceful election day, and that we're prepared. So some actions that we can take. All right, so we have this 100 feet, but you can do things outside that 100 feet, but I suggest that you just don't add any fuel to this. We don't want to cause unnecessary crowding and chaos around polling locations on election day. Don't share misinformation, of course, even if you fact check everything that comes across your news feeds on social media. Don't just hit those share buttons. I would suggest everybody vote early so we can reduce the strain on election day. Like I said, if you're in New Jersey, vote by mail is very accessible. But no matter where you are in the country, there should be a way for you to participate early. There are some ways that you can kind of check it out if from your car, or when you're on your neighborhood walk. If you take a ride by your polling location, make sure that it's accessible, that it's open, that the entrances are clearly marked and there's good signs, and that there's no bad actors kind of hanging around harassing voters. Something that we're seeing, and this is actually particularly social workers in other states doing, are holding de-escalation trainings. And while New Jersey, so like in Ohio, for example, there is poll watching. And people that are participating in poll watching on behalf of the League of Women Voters, they are participating in de-escalation trainings to make sure that they know how to not make a situation worse, maintain safety, maintain calm, maintain peace. And this is really being led by social workers. So as you think about that, I think that de-escalation training, regardless of the fact that we don't have poll watching, given our political climate, is not a bad thing to consider. So we also have a nonpartisan voter engagement toolkit available on our website. And it does have specific information about voter suppression. There's a link there to, I believe it's leadership conferences, voter suppression. They have a whole toolkit about how to kind of help in this area. But there's other information there as well, including social media graphics, templates, different rack cards. There's information available in both English and Spanish about voting rights and vote by mail, things like that. So I do encourage people to share that information. And if you do witness anything, or if you have any questions, or you have any concerns, please do call the Election Protection Hotline. They are keeping track of all of these things and making sure that we are responding to them very quickly. And that is available now. They are open, they're ready to go, and they are fully staffed and ready to answer calls. So I left plenty of time. I'm gonna stop the share. Plenty of time for questions and conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you covered a lot of really great information. A couple of questions that have come in, and we'll just jump into them, but certainly for those of you here in the Zoom room and also watching on Facebook, if you have questions, please shoot them in the message comments or raise your virtual Zoom hand, and we'll bring you online. There is a question from Ronnie that they're concerned about early voting because information on candidates, et cetera, often doesn't come available until closer to election day. And that could have the potential to change people's votes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is an important balance to consider, right? So I always say, vote as early as you feel confident in your choices. Obviously, anything can change, but anything can change on election day too, right? Like nothing's a guarantee. So do your research. The league has a website available, vote411.org, where we ask candidates to give us their answers to some policy questions. We have some ballot question analyses up on that site as well as COVID-specific information voters need to know. Do your research. If you are voting by mail, you have a little bit of the luxury of time to sit down at your table with your ballot in front of you and really go through the different candidates. I encourage folks to use that time. Don't rush your vote. It's important. But at the same time, it's not necessary, I think, to wait till November 3rd to be postmarking that ballot. But New Jersey did make sure that we do have that opportunity available to vote on November 3rd. So if that's the way you want to go, you have that choice. You can use provisional ballot at your polling location. You can go to your polling location and physically hand in your mail-in ballot to a poll worker, or you can drop off your mail-in ballot at your Board of Elections on election day, or you can postmark it on November 3rd. And this one I suggest the least, because I don't want to see ballots arrive late, but you can postmark it November 3rd, and as long as it's received by November 10th, it'll be counted. But again, that's the one I suggest the least. If you're going to wait till November 3rd, do one of the in-person options.
Thank you. I think one of the follow-up questions to that is just around the post office and their the perception that there might be some delays in post office services, et cetera, as a form of voter suppression and as a tactic used this year. I think we saw it seen on the news in the last couple of months that machines perhaps had been removed and reduction in staff, et cetera. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's two things here. One, I think that, you know, we should trust in the integrity of the post office. And I do trust in the integrity of our post office. Specifically, what you're talking about is concerning, right? When you're talking about these kind of rapid changes that are made right around election time, which end up making it harder for folks to use mail-in ballots. Thankfully, a lot of that has been stopped. There are still some communities that are, you know, reporting that postal boxes are being removed from their neighborhoods across the country. I'm talking not just in New Jersey. But I feel like public pressure when that happens is working to stop it. And again, I think this is why it was so important in New Jersey to, one, relax the timeline that it takes for a ballot to be received, not because there might be a problem with you know, shenanigans, but because it's a pandemic and we did see a delay in mail service. And also allowing for, the league did recommend that we allow for people to return those vote by mail ballots in person at their polling locations, because sometimes polling locations are really convenient, depending, you know, if you need to walk or something like this, it can be really convenient to a lot of voters, and having an option close to them was important. We also saw a good expansion of ballot drop boxes in our state. So in the primary, it was 5 per county. And then for the general election, it was a minimum of 10, and most all counties have done more than 10, and a lot have done significantly more than 10. So, you know, if there is any concerns about restrictions on mail, New Jersey is trying to counter that by making sure that there's a lot of accessibility in other ways.
That's great. I think one of the things we can be very proud of here in New Jersey is our stance in really protecting and trying to make sure that everybody has access to voting. And as a state, comparatively, we've done some really great things. Another question that has come in regarding, letting somebody in the room as well, regarding voter suppression and just what can we do as individuals, long lines, you know, and slowness of ability for early voting in some states, but also thinking ahead to election day and long lines and making sure that people are in and being able to wait in those long lines as a mode of voter suppression. Is that a tactic that people are using? But also, what can we do as individuals? Can we hold the line for someone? Can we bring food and water to elderly people waiting? What are some of the recommendations on election day?
Yeah, so in other states, we are seeing this. I think that and right across the river here in Philly, we're seeing the league and others kind of do this, where they're bringing water and food to folks waiting in line and acting in an encouraging way as people wait to exercise the right to vote. But people shouldn't have to wait in line like that, right? Like there's a little bit of a narrative kind of celebrating the folks in line's dedication, and that's absolutely true. You know, people are waiting in line hours and hours to cast a ballot, and that says something about how important that ballot is to them, and that should be celebrated. But we should not be celebrating the fact that they have to wait in line at all. I'm really hoping in New Jersey we don't see that. Now, like I said, there has been consolidation of polling locations. New Jersey requires each town to have at least one and at least half of them to be open per county. It looks like it's varying around the state. Some places have more than others. I think that if in your particular community, if you're concerned about it, maybe look to see, you can go to vote.nj.gov and look to see where the polling locations are available in your community. And if there's a concern about that, about not having enough, reach out to your Board of Elections about it. I think encouraging people to vote using their vote by mail ballot is super important. I actually don't know the answer to your question about can people in New Jersey bring people in line food. And the reason I don't know is because we have this unique 100 feet rule that other states don't, and it's never come up. So this is one of those things where I think that after this, I'll find the answer. I'll call the Division of Elections and ask and see if somebody has an absolute on this, but I don't think it's ever come up before because we've never had these kind of long lines.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear that we've never had the long lines and some of these things haven't come up. But I think, you know, as activists in all of us, and certainly the social work community wants to do whatever they can. So if you could help us find that answer, I think that'd be very much appreciated. I know on election day, many people take off to help and get out the vote and drive people to polling places, et cetera. So I know that we've heard that question a couple of times. What can we do? Can we bring chairs? Can we hold the place? What can we do to make sure that everyone has the right? And if we do see those long lines, they'll be prepared.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not that there's never been lines in New Jersey. I think we've seen lines, particularly I'm thinking like Jersey City, I've seen lines. But they haven't been the kind of lines that I think we're talking about where, you know, we see these reports of somebody saying, I waited 4.5 hours, I waited 8 hours. I've been here since 7 a.m. and it's 7 p.m. and I haven't gotten in yet. And I think that's where people want to help the most. But yeah, I definitely will follow up because honestly, I need to know too now. I'm really curious about what we're allowed to do about lines and if the 100 feet prohibits any helpful activities there.
Yeah, we do see that, and we see those social media posts that people have been ordering food and been ordering pizzas and having people bring water in some of those really tremendous lines. So it's certainly something that we're seeing in other locations. And for our community that's watching from outside of the state, you know, we're always inspired by their organizing and resourcefulness. So we want to make sure that if we do things here in New Jersey, we're following the rules and the laws, because certainly I don't think anybody wants to be seen or participatory in something that would call into question the process or elections or violate any of those rules.
Yeah, and the de-escalation training that I mentioned, so just this morning I saw one that was a result of voting rights advocates, clergy, like faith-based groups, and social workers who came together to hold de-escalation trainings for poll observers, poll watchers. But it also applies to any kind of, like, you can have de-escalation trainings set up for protests and things like this, or an expectation of any kind of potential protest around the election. So it's something to consider.
So we have another question that came in, a little bit off topic, but I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to address it as well. If someone received a mail-in ballot from the wrong town, should the person vote in person, or is that ballot negated if it came from the wrong location or sent to a wrong address? Any thoughts on that?
So I think I'm a little, so if the ballot was sent, so I don't know if this is like a ballot was sent to me, Jesse Burns, at, and I'll use this work one, like 204, like at the right street address, but it had, you know, instead of Trenton, it had Ewing or something. If that's what they're talking about, then they should clarify with the Commissioner of Registration / Superintendent of Election, depending on where they are, about their voter registration address. Because sometimes it's, you know, New Jersey, we have like a million towns, and sometimes your mailing address and what your town is aren't the same. Like, so if there's questions around that, go to your county election official. If you receive a ballot for somebody else, you should, like at your address, you should send that back to your county election official and saying like return to sender, not at this address. When I'm talking about voting roll purges, so New Jersey does some good things, right? That prevent us from purging. And they have a system where instead of some other states, unfortunately, what they were doing was if somebody didn't show up for a certain number of elections, they took them off the rolls. And in New Jersey, what happens is if a piece of election mail gets returned, so if you get a sample ballot and it gets returned, you can't forward election mail for this reason. That voter gets moved to inactive, which means that they're not taken off the rolls. It just means that they need to, verify their eligibility in some way, not through like an identification, but basically if they showed up to the polling place on election day and they were inactive, they would sign an affirmation statement and be able to vote, as opposed to not just being taken off the rolls. So it's important that when you receive election mail incorrectly for somebody who might have lived at your address before, that you do send it back with that on it, because that alerts the county election officials that somebody moved. So I'm not sure if I got it, but I did two different things just in case.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think always when there's a question, contact your Board of Elections, right? Just contact them and try to sort it out. If there are names that appear on your ballot for a different town, or you think that you've gotten the wrong information, call to sort that out with them so that you can make sure that you're voting on the right ballot for the right people and they have the right contact information.
Yeah, so the election offices, basically in New Jersey, the way it works is your county clerk issues your vote by mail ballot. So if you haven't received your ballot by now, so if you are active and registered and you haven't received your ballot today, after we get off of this, contact your county clerk, because there's something going on and you need to get that ballot. That's what your county clerk's for. The commissioner of registration / superintendent of elections, that's voter registration. These are really simplified. The Board of Elections is where you return ballots. So they're basically like election day. They run polling places, they do the count, that's where the ballots go. So depending on what your issue is, you have a different office, but they all work very closely together. So if you contact one, they'll just transfer you to the right one.
Great. Another question came in regarding the Board of Elections. Who do they report to? Freeholders, county executives? What's that reporting structure look like?
I don't know. So the Board of Elections is made up of, they're a bipartisan body, like a certain number of R's and a certain number of D's that work together. I don't know who they're accountable to. Another good question that I will find the answer to. I love the things I've never been asked before, because it gives me something.
Leave it to the social workers. Leave it to the social workers. Another question that came in from outside of the Zoom room was just if you could speak a little bit to the repercussions for candidates calling for people to engage in voter suppression tactics. Where is the accountability there? What can happen to candidates who are engaged in promoting such behavior? Or is there checks and balances outside of just voting in general?
So I don't think that there's enough accountability for it. A lot of it, I feel like, is just accepted. There are, depending on the state, I think that there's different involvement. So in New Jersey, the Attorney General gets involved in those kind of issues. But it really, the involvement really happens almost too late, right? Like once it starts. But at the same time, it's very hard. It's like we're not thinking, like we're trying to balance between, I don't think there is a lot of accountability for a candidate, like to say, in New Jersey, if somebody's like, be a poll watcher, do this, and then they didn't provide their volunteers with the information that they need in order to do that correctly and safely, that's unfortunate. And the volunteers are going to face issues on election day if they break that 100-feet rule, if they harass voters. But unfortunately, I don't think that there's enough accountability, I think, to kind of prevent these things from happening. I also think we're just, you know, so legislation's being heard right now. So we try to counter it with things like legislation and the consent decree and things like that. Legislation's being heard right now that prohibits, in New Jersey, that prohibits the presence of law enforcement officers at voting locations. So this is a way we try to kind of counter that. Just the idea in New Jersey that voters might encounter police presence like that 1981 gubernatorial election situation is enough to intimidate voters and keep them home, right? So legislators and advocates worked on legislation that we hope goes through to prevent that situation from happening again. But I don't know how to prevent candidates from doing it.
I think we'd all like to know that, right? It's $1 million question.
Yeah, accountability and who you vote for and what you call out and what you allow and public pressure. All these things are important tools. Whether a candidate is not representing you in the way you would wish, or if they're doing something you deem, maybe dangerous. It's important to hold folks accountable for that.
Absolutely. Someone just asked if you could again share the steps if you are being harassed when you go to the polling station. What are the things that you should do, and who do you call?
First of all, don't let it prevent you from voting. I think that's number one. One of the things I suggest, and I really don't think this is going to be an issue, right? So I don't want people to think that because we're talking about this, it's because we're fearful of it. That's not true. We just want to make sure that people have information needed, okay? Don't think it's going to be an issue. Have two plans, basically. If you're going to be voting on election day at a ballot drop box or at a polling location, know what alternatives you have for casting that ballot in case you need to kind of go to plan B. And no matter what, cast your ballot, okay? Don't engage, report it. So when you get inside, report it to the poll worker that this is happening outside, report it to the election protection hotline. The poll worker will likely report it to the county election officials, but you should do too. I would say document it, like write it down. I don't know if it's necessary to whip out a cell phone camera or if that's going to make the situation worse. I feel like actually the people on this call know better than I about how to deal with difficult people and dangerous situations, right? But you don't want to engage. Report it. Don't let it prevent you from casting a ballot, and follow up too. Call back and say, was it taken care of? Have they been removed to the person that was causing the offense? Things like that.
I think social workers are really great at making sure that they're documenting appropriately what's happening, and we've really come to sort of de-escalate those situations. But certainly I echo that, don't leave, don't let that prevent you, and have that plan B if it is. And again, unlikely that it will be, contentious, but if it becomes a hostile environment, have that plan B and know where you can go, know where your boxes are, know where you can drop it off in person at other locations. I think that's really important. Can you speak a little bit to the process, if you know about it, that if you're denied your ability to vote when you arrive, what are the remedies there? If you arrive at your polling station and do.
I'm glad you brought this up because I forgot to include it, and it's important. So you do have the right to go before an election judge on election day. A lot of people don't know this, and I'm really glad this question came up because I should have included this in a slide. And this happens a lot. So let's say you go to, not a lot, I'm sorry. We hear this a lot because people call us with these problems, and when we send them to an election day judge, it's not like it happens a lot on the grand scale of things. I hear this. So if you go to your polling location and for some reason you're denied the right to vote, like they say you're not on the rolls and you believe that you did register, that's probably the number one thing that will happen. You can go to an election day judge. So if you call the election protection hotline, if you contact the League of Women Voters, we'll assist you in talking to an attorney to talk you through that. But I don't know if it's likely mostly going to be virtual on election day. For the primary, it was. Some courthouses, it's at the county courthouse. Some of them have some social distancing and opening in place. It's all going to be different, and I hope you don't have to find out. But basically what you do is you go in front of a judge and you say, no, I registered at the MVC and I should be eligible to vote. I made a good faith effort. Then the judge will decide whether or not you do have that ability, and they'll give you like a court order to allow for you to vote. In normal circumstances, that means that you would have voted on the machine. But since everybody's voting provisionally, I believe what will happen is that there'll be something with the provisional ballot they'll keep with the provisional ballot that says what your situation was, so your provisional ballot's not tossed.
I think that's so important. I think people get there, and while it doesn't happen often, at least that we hear about, there is a process in place and mechanism and people and attorneys. And so people can call your number, they can get connected to an attorney that works for the state of New Jersey, and there is a process in place by which you'll be heard. And I do believe that there will be some in person and some virtual as well. I know a few attorneys.
The attorney that works for the state is not the voter's attorney, though. That's right. The state's attorney. So that's why you have like the ACLU and the election protection and election attorneys that volunteer to represent the voter. I'm not saying that the state's attorney is out to get you, yeah. But I'm just saying that there's a difference, and it's good to have. You don't necessarily need, it's up to you, depending on your situation, whether or not you'll have counsel, but at least being able to talk through your situation could help when you go to in front of the election judge.
Absolutely, and at least take the fear and a little bit of the scare out of it, as I imagine it can feel a little intimidating if that's what you're presented with.
Well, I mean, it's for the folks on this call, it probably feel like activism in action. You know, I'm fighting for my right to vote kind of thing. But yeah, I think for most people, I know it would be scary for me.
Yeah, and I think that's something important that as social workers we can also take to the communities and the populations that we serve. That we're making sure that we're passing this knowledge along. That we know that, you know, the people that we are working with know what the process is and know that they do have the right to contact you if they're being denied their right to vote. And sometimes social workers, we are the best advocates, but we also have to empower our communities to know their rights as well. Well, as we start to wrap up today's conversation, what would you think the 3 largest takeaways are in terms of voter suppression and what we can do?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, what you and I just talked about is don't let anything stand in your way, okay? Like, you have the right to vote, use it. Know all your options. I think that's huge. I think also expect, you know, a peaceful election day here. Know that there's a lot of folks that are hard at work, making sure that we have a lot of safeguards in place that protect voting rights. And then I think the third thing for me is it's not just about November 3rd. And the reason that I said that was because when I talk about what we've been seeing since 2013 across the country, our work is not going to stop come November 3rd, no matter what happens. There's still an effort across the country to kind of roll back a lot of the voting rights wins that we've had over the last century. So I think getting involved in conversations around voting rights in general, and not just in the reaction to the immediate threats that we're seeing as we reach election day is so critically important. And I encourage people to, use particularly social workers who have very specific skill sets that are needed, both in divisive and challenging environments, but also when we need to maintain a level of activism and energy that can often be hard to hold on to once the immediate crisis is gone, right? So I encourage folks to get involved and continue the fight, regardless of what happens come November 3rd.
I think that's so incredibly important. You know, while we're in the midst of it right now, there are things that are happening every day within our communities that are rolling back the rights of others to vote and really challenging the systems. And it's important for us to dial in 365 to make sure that we're holding our legislators and our communities accountable, to make sure that, you know, when it comes to election period, that we are not scrambling to protect it, but that we've really done the work in advance and we know what the plans are, and everyone's on the same playing field, or at least we're leveling it a bit, and we know what to expect. And we also need our legislators to understand that if they intend to roll back voting rights and make it more difficult, that's not going to be something that we stand for, and that this is a fundamental right of every citizen, and we want to make sure that we're protecting or doing it all that we can to protect the right to vote. Well, Jessie, thank you so much for joining us today. Your knowledge is always incredibly helpful, and thank you for the work that you're doing as we lead up to this important date in our history. We will certainly look to you for some of those takeaway answers, and I'll connect with the community and share them. We'll share them via social media and for everyone who is joining us today. So we'll be able to get back with you on a couple of follow-ups as well. Thank you so much. And for everybody watching, you're welcome to share this video. We will be posting it to NASW-NJ.org. It's also on our website and our Facebook pages, so you can link to it and share with friends, family, constituents, you name it. We do have a couple of more community conversations and webinars regarding voting and voter rights and all things leading up to the election. So I hope you will join us. You can check out that information on NASW-NJ.org/events and register for them as well. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for your
Jessie.
partnership and for your work. Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.